All right. So thanks everybody. Welcome back to session 2, which is a panel devoted to another research strand of Egenis, which concerns data, knowledge, and AI. And this kind of work has been starting now, probably is going on for pretty much 7 years, in fact, within Egenis. A lot of people have been participating in this research strand. In fact, across the university, that's true, I think, of every research strand in Egenis. This one is particularly cross-disciplinary, of course, and cross-faculty, because almost everybody at the university has a stake and an interest in thinking about how we're dealing with data, how we're thinking about particularly generative AI and what is happening in the world of potential automation right now in research. And my computer switched off also. Okay, that's good. We thought of focusing, and particularly Stephan, who's really played a huge role in putting together this panel and getting us organized, thought about focusing on the issue of automation for this discussion. And this is because this is something that is really coming up left, right, and center when thinking about the role of AI in particular within research at the moment. Is very, very hotly debated. I think in the course of the last 2 years, I've taken, I've taken part in 4 different reports produced by various different organizations, from the Council for Canadian Academies to the European Commission to the Royal Society, all looking at the role of AI and the impact it's going to have on research and development over the last few years. And of course, as usual, the expectations are huge, and particularly this question around automation and the totally transformative weight and role that this is going to play within research is generating a lot of promise, a lot of expectations. And at the same time, of course, as we know from discussion about so far, the moment you start to reflect on this and historicize these kind of developments, we know very well from history that questions around metricization, quantification of human activities, and particularly activities of inquiry, that a very, very long history. A lot of these developments are building on that history, kind of continuing some of those trends. And of course, this continues to be also, and I think that really links it very nicely with the previous panel on biology and environment. It's a very active area where we really need a lot of engagement from a variety of stakeholders. This is not the kind of discussion around the role of AI and automation in research that can be resolved just by having researchers only thinking about what the implications may be and what the role of this transformation is in society. And in fact, in that sense, I'm really glad that we've just soft launched an initiative that brings together Exeter and the University, well, the Technical University of Munich, where I'm going to be based, which is precisely directed at thinking about what does it mean to think about ethical data at the moment, how are we thinking about developments in research, especially and specifically around AI and automation, and how can we bring a more critical and responsible perspective to this by bringing together a lot of different parts of society that are engaged in this, not just researchers, but people who are impacted by the technologies in a variety of different fields, experts that may not be residing in academia per se, farmers communities, for instance, or patient groups, and of course, a variety of different stakeholders, not just the big companies, but small and medium enterprises, NGOs, public administration, these kinds of things. So I think that's the direction of travel for this group. Now we're gonna go straight into the panel, and sorry, the computers. These are the 2 questions that we posed to our panelists in organizing this. The first is, what in your opinion is the most significant or relevant shift to automation in your field of interest? And the second is, what are the contributions that interdisciplinary studies of life sciences, as showcased at this conference, can make when addressing these shifts in research? And so we're going to be hearing our panelists reflecting on these questions for about 5 minutes, and then engaging with each other and responding to each other. And then we're going to open it up and hopefully get comments and questions from you to the panelists. So I'm going to introduce them one by one, given that they're going to be giving their talks, and then only then they're going to sit all together in front. And the first is Professor Sara Green, who's Associate Professor in the section for History and Philosophy of Science of the University of Copenhagen. And of course, many of you know her very well for her work on systems biology, animal models, precision medicine, and so on and so forth.
Thanks so much, Sabina. Yeah, and I have to admit, I struggle a little bit with the first question, because I was thinking I don't work on automation and such, but maybe it's good that I start, because what I do work on, or I'm starting to work on, is what goes kind of ahead of the automated processing of data, namely data collection and data sharing. So I'm involved in a new research project on the European health data space, so EHS, or EHDS. And I'm wondering how many have heard of this? Very few. That's excellent, because then I can actually say something new. So that's really cool. Anyway, but I've been reading a lot of reports on the HDS, and I'm really interested in what appears to be a vision of what we might call automated data sharing. So the EHDS is a very comprehensive legal framework for the EU member states, imposing EU member states to adopt shared data standards, making, that's the aim, making interoperable electronic health data available for cross-border healthcare. That's highlighted as a primary aim, but it comes very clear when you read the reports and sit in on meetings that actually the primary aim might be to make this also available, these data available for academic research, industry, and innovation. So there's a figure here showing kind of the various aims that are envisioned to be fulfilled with the European health data space, to empower individuals to control their health data, give them easier access to data and healthcare across European countries, but it's also to, as it says here, unleash the power of the health data economy and ensure a consistent and efficient framework for the reuse of health data for research. And this is where our research projects comes in, because we're interested in what opportunities will this bring for research in the life sciences, what are the promises, but also the challenges. And I really think this is such a comprehensive legal framework that will have wide-ranging implications. There are 27 EU member states, and this can potentially integrate data from 446, I think it is, million citizens. And many EU member states have universal healthcare, so they also have more or less integrated databases that you could retrieve data from. But it might not be as easy as it seems. We will have larger but also more diverse data sets. And these diverse data sets are both a promise but also a challenge. So the promise is that we could have a comprehensive data infrastructure for real-world evidence that might offer opportunities for, say, identifying disease causes, monitoring intervention effectiveness in more diverse populations in new and more inclusive ways. We had this talk yesterday from Rachel about case reports. So with this, we could actually have a lot of patient cases available for automated analysis. If this is done in the right way, we have a unique opportunity to collect data on things that cannot be collected in traditional clinical trials, on populations that are traditionally excluded from trials, such as kids, pregnant women. Women in general have traditionally not been very prominent in clinical trials, elderly, patients with comorbidity. There are unique opportunities here, and also because the EHDS adopts a very expansive definition of health data, we can actually do new things with these kinds of data. So researchers are very excited about this future or near future opportunity. It gives also statistical power to research on rare diseases and precision medicine in general. And I mention precision medicine here in connection to rare diseases because with precision medicine, we might see really a slicing of a lot of the traditional disease categories where more and more diseases will be rare and unique diseases. So therefore you need a lot of data. And sometimes personalized or precision medicine is perceived as a science of the individual, but it really requires data on large populations. And in Denmark, where I'm based, that's often depicted as a really rich source for research, data-intensive research, but it's also a very homogeneous population. So this allows multiple comparisons across different EU member states. But there are also some challenges, as you might imagine. And for those of you who buy Sabina's arguments and others that have worked in the field about the challenges of making data travel, and I do, I think there are reasons to expect that the highly contextual nature of health data makes it quite questionable that pan-European standards can serve all intended purposes without compromising some uses. So it's also a question about whether all these purposes can actually be realized using these interoperable standards. If there are, like, if you can find one standard to rule them all without any trade-offs. So that's one of our research questions in a new research project. And this is a project, I should perhaps say, that is EU funded. It's led by Klaus Høyer, who's an STS researcher. Sabina is also on the advisory board. And I'm leading a work package primarily looking into what these standards mean for the users. And one of the questions we have is whether these harmonized data standards will be sufficient to facilitate harmonized and unbiased interpretations also. And researchers seem to be quite worried about the perspective of using these highly contextual data to make comparisons. We also saw that in Rachel talk yesterday, even with infection data and making COVID data travel, those problems, I think, really explode when you're talking about very complex health data collected in very different systems, not for the purposes of sharing, but for local purposes and how they're integrated in all kinds of other practical uses. Yeah, and why study this from an interdisciplinary perspective? I think there's a lot of philosophical questions here about the epistemic implications for researchers and also the practical uses, whether you can have data standards without compromising some epistemic aims. But we're also in this research project interested in the experiential dimension, which requires also the use of qualitative methods. It requires ethnographic observation of what these new standards actually do in practice, how it affects primary users, clinicians, and patients, how they may afford certain things, but also impose new forms of data work and new responsibilities on some of the stakeholders. So I think what we're aiming to do is actually both studies of these ethnographic observations and interviews. We're also trying to intervene in policy making. I'm now adopting Jane's conceptual framework here by pointing to the risks. This may also be a study against, but we're also trying to collaborate with scientists and clinicians that are worried about these same issues, and also trying to make some constructive recommendations for how to avoid some of the risks here. And my experience is that that kind of interdisciplinary work, doing more empirical work, is not always recognized by philosophers. I sometimes go back to where I graduated and I get confronted with questions like, so how is this philosophy, or don't you miss doing philosophy? And I think really, like, having a history, even if it was short, in Egenis, being part of the SPSP community, to me at least, has helped me defend and also taught me that this is not only legitimate to do, but also totally worth it. So for that, I'm really grateful. So yeah, that's it for me. Sorry if I was.
So next up we have Niccolò Tempini, who is, of course, a colleague of mine. I used to be in the program we had on data a few years back. He's now a senior lecturer here in Egenis and working in social studies of information systems and digital infrastructures, particularly revolving around questions of health. So perfect for optimism.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to share a couple of ideas I've been thinking about for a long time. I take it that we had a lot of freedom because also because I have to say that in the program it's automation in biology. Now we have automation in research here, and I was asked to do automation in health. So I thought I'm going to average it all out, and it's just going to be about automation and nothing else, and that will be keep me on the safe side. Just joking a little bit, but really, well, yes, I'll keep it a little bit conceptual. I mean, the idea is you know, to maybe try to ask a little bit about where is automation, and through a series of provocations, if you want. And one is that automation is everywhere, of course, and that's why we're here talking about this, right? Okay, so these days everybody keeps talking about automation. The appeal of AI is unmistakable. We read about it every day in the news, and we've been playing with these toys as well. Well, it is actually, I think, a very interesting moment in Egenis to think about these things as well, because, you know, I don't want to offend anybody, but we have sometimes been a little bit behind the curve on discussions of automation. I'm not saying AI, because obviously they're two very different things, and we can study AI without talking about automation, and the other way around as well. So the fact that we're actually thinking about the concept of automation is important, precisely because of this difference. So 10 years ago, I was finishing a PhD at LSE on the way in which digital technology, infrastructure, and specifically automation technology was enabling innovative ways to conduct health research. So I was looking at a website that used recommender systems with a mix of pre-coordinated and post-coordinated data entry to basically get citizens to supply lots of interesting health information that people could use for research. The idea there was to develop automated technologies, interactive technologies, through a website, but with enormously complex backend behind it, so that you could get as much data as you could from these people without generating lots of biased artifacts, just of, you know, for instance, having computers that go a bit too far in filling the information, filling in the form for the patient. So this was the, you know, thinking about it a bit more generally, this, you know, big dream that we see all the time in the IT industry of building these giant computational machines that can crunch all sorts of problems by finding new relationships between data items, in this case, health data items, looking at all sorts of combinations between symptoms and conditions and measurements and lab results, and with the idea that basically if you have enough data, if you have data in a different way from the way usually collected from a hospital to events, through people showing up when they're sick and so on and so forth, you could find lots of stuff that haven't been found yet. And so back then there was a buzz. It wasn't automation, it was crowdsourcing. That was the buzzword. And in this case it was crowdsourcing through social media. For me, this led me to work on data intensive infrastructures and try to characterize precisely data intensive infrastructures, because I thought that automation technology was important. And when we talk about and study data infrastructures, there's always a bit the question, well, do you think that the data infrastructure is a bucket where you put things in and then you move the bucket? But if you say data intensive infrastructure, you are implying that actually this infrastructure runs and crunches and uses some of the data that it is actually collecting in order to fuel its own operation through computations. And so it is a particular subset. Now, fast forward 10 years, people are not very interested in the word crowdsourcing anymore. You barely see it anywhere. The buzz is fizzled, however, everybody is interested in automation. Crowdsourcing, maybe also some of you might have heard it in respect to citizen science, right? And everybody might remember, lots of people might remember experiments such as Zooniverse, Fold It, asking people to fold proteins, or also in astronomy, famous astronomy, was that Zooniverse?
Galaxy.
Galaxy, yeah. And yet, so the provocation here is that crowdsourcing is everywhere, and that can be a way a little bit to think about automation in a slightly less you know, straightforward and obvious way. Because I would say crowdsourcing and computational automation are two sides of the same coin. On this, I'm building from the work of Bonnie Nardi and Hamid Ekbia, who've talked about heterogeneation. So sometimes nowadays, because we talk about, for instance, AI and jobs and automation of work, lines of work, and so on and so forth, people assume that once you get the AI in, the people are out. But this might be true in the sense of scale, but not exactly in the sense of scope. So here I'm sharing my interest in terms of provocations. I'm not trying to convince you all. I'm sure some will resist it, but anyway, automation comes with crowds, in my view. Okay. Think about large language models. Okay, everybody knows what they are now. They need constant input, right? First of all, in order to train them, you need to harvest the whole internet. You might have read last week that the large language model giants are running out of data, because in order to actually prepare for ChatGPT 5, for instance, you just need more data than the internet actually has, essentially, because nobody has come out with the new idea on how to make it smarter. The only idea has been get more data. So there's creating Google Maps reviews, for instance, as a way to improve the quality of the output. So that's the whole internet. Then in the labs where they develop them, there's red teaming, engineers that try to crash, the ethical alignment of the software, so that you just correct things before they go out in the wild and everybody then shouts. Then there's users. If you've used ChatGPT, you might know that often these interfaces will have a thumbs up and thumbs down, so that you can train the learner as to outputs that really failed and outputs that really hit it. And then there's also Kenyan moderators, as being widely reported, for instance, that in order to launch ChatGPT, OpenAI subcontracted lots of training work to the global south, in particular Kenya, where you have lots of people that, again, run it, and they train it. So large language models, these, gem, the kind of the gemstone of the crown of AI is this big faltering machine. This giant golem in the intensive care unit that continuously needs to be revived in order not to decompose and fall apart. But we've seen other examples before large language models. For instance, people talk about also the Mechanical Turk, a system built by Amazon, where scientists could go upload data sets for human processing whenever you have a problem that computers can't solve yet. So image recognition that is particularly complicated, you put out the images, and then there's people all over the world that log in, and they do a bit of, for a few cents, they do a bit of tagging. Of course, the historians here will know the story of the Mechanical Turk, the machine built in the 1700s that was a statue pretended to be an automaton that knew how to play chess and beat grandmasters. They toured the royal courts of Europe until, of course, it was found out there was a human grandmaster inside the machine that was moving it. So large language models also are, of course, a Mechanical Turk in that sense. Hito Steyer, an activist and artist, calls them meme machines, both in terms of, because they work incredibly mind-numbing amounts of memes and arithmetics, and at the same time because they're mean, because they involve the politics of the global south and the exploitation of the human. So to close, my invitation is that when we think about automation, we need to actually try to a bit harder to challenge the black box of analyzing. For instance, often we do value analysis where we, on the back of garbage in, garbage out, we think about what values go into a technology and the values will go out. Discrimination, if you have biased data, you get racial discrimination out or something like that. It's good, it's important, we have to do it, but it's not the whole picture, because all digitalization has been a project of automation. And that's what digital computers are all about, essentially, to transform any kind of problem into a mathematical problem through a cathedral of translation. So my invitation is basically to think about socio-technical automation as socio-technical, as something else that requires us to think about what humans do to enable computers to do what they do. So that it can be useful then to perform an inversion, to become interested in how humans enable computers to do their work. And what happens to human work as it changes to make this happen. this is for the purpose of interdisciplinarity, is bringing a little bit ideas from organization studies into the pictures. So yeah, that's it.
Next up, we have Celso Neto, who is a lecturer here at Egenis. He has done his postdoctoral studies with Ford as part of a larger cohort of people that, as they now established, come to us wonderfully from Ford British Lab. And Celso is doing working class with biology and race. And
yeah, thank you very much, Sabina. Thank you all. It's really great to celebrate John and Egenis. I'm working on human genetic diversity, and the first question was, what about automation? How does it impact this field? There are two very general trends that we all have seen it, right? So one trend is the development of technologies for DNA sequencing, such that nowadays, in less than 1 day, the whole genome of one particular person can be sequenced, right? This sort of advancement in data collection was simply not possible 20 years ago. So that's a trend, the accumulation of data, right? For reasons, motivations such as precision medicine, that's really the big key notion. Now, the second trend is something that relates to some figures that I have for you today, like this one. So if we have large amounts of data, we need to visualize and interpret this data, right? So 20 years ago, this sort of algorithm made a huge splash. So this was referred during Philip Kitcher's talk. So that idea that we can divide human populations in different types of groups, assigning ancestry, allegedly ancestral source populations to parts of your genome, right? So some very interesting details about this algorithm. I think it actually helped to put even more pressure on the idea of real populations here, right? So this is a Bayesian algorithm that requires simply lots of training, repetitions and iterations of the data in order to even something like this make sense, first of all. So people basically run genetic similarity analysis in this feedback loop way at least 10,000 times to come up with a figure like that one. So it's highly technologically constrained. So more widespread than this algorithm is actually this sort of graph, PCA, where people also organize human genetic diversity in terms of clusters. And here they try to represent roughly the kind of 2 dimensions of diversity. And the idea is that spatially, you are representing differences in ancestry or differences in genetic similarity. So notice this is an interesting image from a study from 2008, where the claim was that genetic diversity mirrors spatial distribution in geography in Europe. So you might imagine how many assumptions about geography and distribution of genes goes into this type of graph. One important thing about this type of graph, actually, that's one main key thing, is that it's really good at compressing and simplifying large amounts of data. That's why this is so used, but this is not good enough anymore. PCA is kind of old, actually. 2018, we have something, the new promise of simplified data is called UMAP. This really, so it generates again like this kind of 2-dimensional graphs, right? But it's really, but one thing it does, it really distorts the spatial distribution of clusters such that it's really, really easy to interpret what's going on these figures. So much so that if you follow Twitter or anything on Nature, you know that this graph came from a key study highly funded by the National Institute of Health in the US. It came out 2 months ago, and this figure is like the most controversial one. One thing that this figure is doing that's highly problematic, and it invites philosophers, social scientists to think about, is the use of racial and ethnicity labels in a way that combine by coloring the clusters as if races, ethnicities, and ancestry groups are correlated. So the correlation is implicit by the very coloring of the representations. So using this type of labels is a mess. Scientists recognize that, they are afraid of this. No wonder we have consensus reports coming every basically 5 years. The last one from the National Academies of Science, really great report, a great example of interdisciplinary work. Amazing. I follow for 2 years all the workshops, hearings. We have private companies, we have scientists, we have the public tuning in, and we have this report with several recommendations. Now, one thing that struck me is that philosophers of science were not there. So maybe that's because they don't need philosophers of science, maybe because just a sociological factor, there was no one available, no one around. So it's a sort of puzzle. And what I want to end up with is that this puzzle to me just became more and more salient after I actually read the report. The whole recommendations are premised on the idea of trust. However, trust is highly ambiguous in this context. They are talking about trust from the perspective of scientists, but it's not clear that this translates to how the public sees trust. So the expression trustworthy research is used all the time, but usually the values that they attach to this expression are values that scientists praise, but not necessarily the public. So I could say a lot of things about this report. I'm happy to talk about it, but thank you so much.
Next up, we have Professor James Wakefield. James is Professor of Integrative Cellular Biology here at the University of Exeter. He's also in the Department of Biosciences. He's had a long history of collaboration with Egenis pretty much since the day you arrived, before you arrived in Exeter, in fact. And last but not least, through a project together with John Dutton and Gemma Anderson in the last few years. So quite a few of you will have seen and met James before. But yeah, looking forward to our introduction.
Thank you. So I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is read from notes, because I have 5 minutes, and I know that I tend to just go off on one if I'm not kind of regulated that way. So I'm going to talk about automation of unbiased quantification of image data, its value, its drawbacks, how interdisciplinarity science can help us acknowledge and broaden the conceptual framework of how we do science and how we do life sciences research. Or to see or not to see, that is the question. So as a cell biologist, when I learned my trade in the 1990s, I looked down microscopes. The process that I study is cell division. So you can see up there, this is a fluorescence image of cell dividing. So what you're looking at in this fixed thing on the left-hand side are thousands of dynamic protein fibers. They're called microtubules, and they help to generate this structure called the mitotic spindle. And that's what's going to align chromosomes and allow them to segregate, and you get accurate cell division. So I used to do kind of very careful observation. Okay, I used to focus my attention to determine what a normal cell looked like, so what a controlled cell population looked like, determine morphological variants and phenotypes by eye. And then I took a photograph of what I saw using a bit of, using a camera and a film. Then I used to go and develop that. And then I used to expose it, different exposures. And then I used to have my pictures that I would then put on posters or publish or whatever. In the late 90s, early noughties, then digital cameras and microscopes came on board. So it linked to detectors, shifting the emphasis away from the individual looking down the microscope down to looking at a computer screen. And that made it far easier to generate high amounts of data, numbers of images, fields of views of cells. And that kind of led to a bit of a shift in terms of the change in the statistical power that was available to researchers. In terms of manually measuring parameters, creating graphs and histograms, and looking at parameters like cell shape, cell size, cell cycle stage, organelle distribution, those sorts of things. And then as computer processing capability increased further, software packages became freely available, and people could start to quantify many more parameters. So first through things like point-click functions. So you click on a place and then you click on another place, and then that will automatically tell you the distance between the two rather than getting your ruler out. And then through the development of things like threshold-based identifiers, where you click on a point, and because of the way that it recognizes the image, it will automatically identify a region of interest and then measure that for you. So those sorts of things. Even as far back as kind of 2008, we started to use AI-based tools, but they weren't called as such then. So augmented segmentation analysis, hidden Markov models, random forest walking, these sorts of algorithms that helped us to process things. So automatically identifying, classifying, extracting features from thousands of cells simultaneously. That really opened up the perspective of doing genome-wide studies. So you can take a population, you can either mutate it, or you can disrupt the function in some way of every single gene in that genome, and then you could automatically look at various characteristics and see which characteristics are changed. So that kind of provides, that was transformational. It provided the power needed to kind of make deterministic-like conclusions on, as they saw it, gene function. And these types of analysis are really widespread now. The benefits, I think, are obviously really clear. So it saves time and the cost associated with doing the research by paying somebody to do it. It deals with the issue of observer bias by taking the individual away from it. And it allows subtle but significant biological changes to be recognized in a way that it's difficult to do if you don't have the numbers in there. And that's obviously an intrinsic problem with biological processes, which tend to, even though you disrupt them, they tend to kind of come back towards an attractor-like state. So, for example, with that kind of mitotic spindle, you can disrupt it in a variety of ways, get rid of a lot of different genes, and you'll still end up coalescing to that mitotic spindle. But there are drawbacks, and that's what I want to focus the last half on, and this links to the interdisciplinarity. So it epitomizes that subject-object problem. So it reinforces the dogma that valid scientific exploration is non-participatory, and that measuring the process that you're studying is the endpoint of doing the science. Secondly, by limiting or fully removing engagement of an individual, of the scientist, it simplifies and narrows the conclusions that can get drawn by doing the experiment. Or as James might acknowledge, it limits the adjacent possible of the actual experiment itself. And how the experimenter is part of that. So how can interdisciplinarity help? Well, I am convinced that incorporating humanities, social sciences, philosophy provides an opportunity to really augment scientific activity if we're truthful with ourselves about how we do science. So John and I kind of first crossed spheres about a decade ago with a shared fascination of when you remove different pathways and sub-processes of this process of mitotic spindle formation, how the cell still manages to form that spindle. And then that led to an introduction with Gemma Anderson, artist and practitioner, for whom John was a PhD supervisor. And then we got an AHRC funded project to look at drawing processes of life. So how you can take a four-dimensional cellular process in time, and represent it in 2 dimensions through art and drawing. And that, albeit very periodic immersion in philosophy and art, really started a process in me of self-reflecting on how I do science and how, as general scientists, do science. And for me, the kind of classical roots in descriptive developmental biology, the acknowledgement and the validity of being part of that process. And that in turn has led me to kind of describe the actual process by which I do science. And that's what I kind of wanted to just spend the last minute or 2 on. And so this is a defined scientific workflow that I'm calling kind of flow, attendant, flex, or FAF. Right, and I'm gonna try to explain why faffing around is a good thing. Okay, so first, flow. So flow is this state, right, in which people are so involved in a process and an activity that it feels effortless. It's like it's being in the zone. It's the same thing as, yeah, I'm going to use the analogy of baseball. It's got, I don't know, the left-handed one of baseball or cricket or golf. Yeah, a sporting activity where you're just focused in the zone, or music or drama going before you go onto stage. You get yourself into a particular kind of relationship with yourself. And it creates this kind of positive and rewarding mental state, which is correlated with optimal or enhanced performance. When people have investigated this, they've done so in that context of focused, highly skilled kind of visuomotor activity. So it tends to be in the sports and in gaming and other things like that. But I would argue that it's just as valid for scientific inquiry, especially a process like cell biology, where you're engaging through an intermediate, like a microscope, and you're connecting with a sample. So trying to explore that, you know, we can achieve that by, and we do that anyway, right? We can do that through controlling our local environment. We're going into a very small, dark room for a start. The routine and the ritual that comes with turning on particular buttons on the microscope in sequence, settling yourself down, that kind of thing. You can enhance it by specific haptic visual exercises. So something that kind of Gemma and I explored was taking platonic solids and just exploring them before you then start looking down the microscope, to keep reminding yourself that you're actually looking at a 3-dimensional object on that microscope. And then also by other physical enhancers, things like music, things like drawing, pictures that are on the wall, those sorts of things. So that's the kind of flow side of things. Oh, I should have done that, shouldn't I? There we go. And then there's the kind of attend. So attend is kind of emphasizing what classically we do anyway. So you begin with a cursory connection to the sample that you're looking at. And you're kind of following to get to know the sample and going, is it right? Does it feel right? Does it seem right in relation to the other experiences that I've had in the past? And then that builds a relationship of understanding with the sample, and one might say kind of sympathy with the sample, which in turn kind of provides, well, we call it like a conceptual engine that propels the way that we see and imagine the process, even though that might be a once alive and now dead sample. I can talk about that more later. And then there's flex. So flex builds on this concept of cognitive flexibility and complexity, first described by William Scott in 1962. And that's defined as the readiness with which the person's concept system changes in response to appropriate stimuli. So it refers to the ability to near simultaneously switch your attention, your imagination, and the way in which you kind of approach a problem. So, for example, kind of recollecting filtered and prior knowledge, or differentiating from what was known to what you're experiencing to what that might mean, or imagining what it might be in the future, cultivating intentional switching. And something that's kind of important in the work that I do, for example, is trying to understand what you're looking at from the perspective of mechanism, and then looking at it from the perspective of process, You might want to look at it in terms of statistical likelihoods or energy flows, sets of attractor states, those sorts of things. You can switch the way you're thinking about a biological process whilst you're recollecting it. And then, as with any good scientific practice, you reflect, revise, repeat, and you don't do this on your own, right? You do this in community. You do this with the other scientists and the researchers you're working with. So faffing about is kind of in stark contrast to this very removed cursory practice that we say we do as scientists, and actually bringing this all back to automation, where we're headed. So if I look at my PhD students, now they're so removed from the process, right? They take their sample, they go to the microscope, they click a button, they go and have a cup of tea. They then come back, they download their data, they go to a shared research office, and at some point they'll plug it into automated software image analysis, and then they'll get their results. So I think that, you know, we have to be a little bit careful about where we go. And I'm not saying that it's not valid to do either way, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say there are different ways to do science, and maybe they're complementary and they help to enhance one another. And I think that's where I'm going.
Last but not least, we have Stephan Güttinger, who has been absolutely the animating spirit, but also the pair of hands who's done all the hard work behind this session. So thank you very much again, Stephan, for this. And Stephan is a lecturer here in Egenis and is working on data systems, but also questions of automation, questions of transformation of the research landscape, and also the nature of molecules that we heard already yesterday about his work on viruses. So, Stephan.
Thank you. Sorry, I just need to relieve an itch. So I'm triggered by the blue buttons and the red buttons and all that. So for me, as I'm trying to give a short sort of time for discussion. So for a lot of philosophers of science that I've read, when they think about automation in life sciences, they immediately go to the use of AI, and usually AlphaFold is a very good example, and it's very important. So you see in the top right picture, a scientist sitting in front of a terminal working with AlphaFold. And I think that is very relevant and important, but for me, kind of the most important shift that's happening, and I think it's happening quite rapidly, and it will come, is something that is contrasted in the two other pictures. And so the main difference here between these two pictures is that this here is Eve, and that's not her, but that's the Eve, the robot scientist. And so that is a system that performs a set of experiments on its own, updates its model based on the data it collects, and learns from that in some way or another. So there's automation in both cases. Also, if we assume that's a traditional lab in the top left, there's automatos start moving, you know, fraction collectors, the PCR machine goes through the steps automatically. But the two pictures are very different, because down here you have two entities that learn, not agents maybe or whatever it is, but two systems that learn and that somehow work together. And so I think that's really the fundamental shift that's happening in here. And that brings me to a first kind of interdisciplinary moment. I think what's happening here, science needs whoever the we is, but for instance, pedagogy, child development studies, like what does learning mean? That term, philosophers thinking about learning, I think this term deserves a lot of interdisciplinary exploration, because these systems will learn in different ways. They have different ways of learning, to learn at different speeds and so on. So I think figuring this out is really important. The other thing, I mean, I chose these pictures in a particular way, but you see a single scientist in all of them. So that goes back to points that were raised already. The human is not replaced in that sense necessarily, but what happens is the human is displaced. I mean, you can see, and you see like the red button and stuff, it's like a different setup. And I think the displacement is an interesting one, because it could literally mean I'm just putting this clicker over here, it has been displaced. But in this case, I don't think that happens. I think as something moves, it changes. And so, you know, different skills, and that goes back to what James has said also, kind of how you work. Like you talk about your students being displaced from a cubicle and a setting that you've been in. And so there's a worry that skills are lost. Maybe we see more things because, you know, taking a step back and all that. And so it's just interesting to figure out what happens in these displacements. And I think there's another interdisciplinary moment in there again, which goes to something that Niccolò said about organizational studies. Like how are these new research settings organized? There's a lot of talk when you bring in automated systems about levels of automation, for instance, that goes also into self-driving cars and all that. And the language there is like, who's the supervisor, the controller, who manages whom, and so on. So these kind of organizational studies will be super important here as well, to move forward with understanding what is happening here. And I think the worries that I'm interested in personally are epistemic. So some people worry about, for instance, creativity. I've reread some of the stuff that Adrian Curry, not Haddock, has written on creativity in science and kind of how we could understand that and what might change in here. I think that's a really important question. The one that drives me is something that, from my experience, I think is what I did 95% of the time. Hopefully not due to my limitations, but just because it's part of what science is, which is troubleshooting. You're just trying to figure out what has gone wrong. And I think, to me, this social epistemology is figuring out how we communally shoot trouble. And that's I think that's a very important question that I'm trying to figure out. So I don't have any answers. I'm just throwing out these things that interest me. And maybe for discussion later, I think between error, which is erring, there's a very close connection to creativity, because erring means to go astray, which means to move out of the herd enclosure. And so that's kind of making leaps, which can be interpreted as creativity, like really the unexpected. So, but anyway, I'll leave it at that. I just want to have time for discussions.
The panelists can join me here on stage, and while you're settling down, maybe just one question to start with to get you to discuss with each other and pick up on each other's point. I think I was just reminded in listening to you about Nancy Carter's presentation the first day of this conference, where she was remarking on how economic modeling at least seems to work, or could be taken to work, only when situated in very particular small worlds. And I was wondering, like, given what you were thinking, can automation work beyond what she calls small worlds? And what then now a small world within which automation could work look like for automation in research? And that's a question that can apply to AI models, to robotic systems, to mining infrastructures. It looks like all the examples of settings for automation that you were discussing are actually very hard to constrain in ways that can be fully articulated, fully controlled. Certainly James' fantastic description of how biologists may achieve this kind of fruitful relationship with an experimental setup doesn't really seem to match this expectation we keep associating with automation. Sorry, I was hoping in the ceiling. Anyway, of objectivity and independent operations that are, associated with this realm. So I was wondering, does this question make sense to you? And also more generally, questions of know-how and trust that came up in association to, or critique, in fact, of automation attempts in all of your talks. How do you think about it, also in relation to each other's work? You want to respond, Sara?
Yeah, I think these are really excellent questions. And I think it's one of my concerns with the European health data space, that it's not realized how different the worlds of the different EU member states, for instance, are. And if you don't take that into account, this complexity and all the various factors that really influence what kinds of data are being recorded, how, under what circumstances they're reported, in what formats, you end up with very confusing results. And I was thinking of, on one hand, we may have, you mentioned large language models. So there is this hope that we don't have to, that they will somehow save us from the standardization into small world-like systems, because there is this hope that they could deal with the messiness of qualitative data in electronic health records and so on. And I need to know more about these models, but I have some worries about that optimism. But perhaps you want to follow up.
Yeah. So I follow first from Sabina
Yeah.
because I was taking a note to change but my general instinct is that maybe sometimes I found myself in these kind of debates on the a little bit like I feel I'm on the contrarian side on some of the kind of default takes that we have in science studies around automation, around ICT, around the importance of IT, these bastard objects that nobody really wants to love because one thing is AI and data science, but actually IT is really, you know, mouse and keyboards. Because I think it, you know, just I mean, the answer is already there in infrastructure studies literature. People have made the same point over and over again, that of course, when you have digital technology, it only works if you continuously do the work of adaptation and maintenance. That basically the technologies keep failing, and so you've got to get them back and running. And so these kind of technologies are never actually really universal. They're never really globalized. They're never you know, contextless in that sense, because if you assume that's going to be the case, well, you're going to be frustrated. But at the same time, you know, a lot of the time they actually do some work, and they are actually built oftentimes more like a dishwasher than like a butler, as in you set up the dishwasher and then you can leave and do something else in the meantime. You don't necessarily, we often talk about automation as if it is just about an extension of our strength, you know, also power, you know, you have manpower there, or human power, or person power. And you know, like a tractor, you know, that changes the yield because it makes you work more, but you still have to drive it. And instead, there's obviously automation like dishwashers that really frees your time, but also you're understanding what's going on. So you know, in a historical organization studies, I'm thinking, for instance, about the study that made Zuboff really famous, because I think in our world here, most people know Zuboff because of surveillance capitalism from 2015 and 19, but she was already semi-retired and the first emeritus professor, tenured woman in Harvard Business School. Because of her work from 1987 about automation in the workplace, where she talked about the digitalization of work as a matter of informating and automating, as a matter of translating processes that are embodied and highly contextual in the contextualized symbolic representations, and the change of work into a matter of mastering the electronic text. That becomes also work, so that comes with the automation bit, comes also work of course, of breakdown, and then you have these kind of cognitive dissonances of workers trying to catch up with what's going on with the machine, precisely because they don't have a sense of what the machine is doing at all times. So then you are in the labs and something doesn't work, and then you have also workers that don't exactly know how the machine works, but need to find out what's broken, and you have this dissonance. But that is testament to the fact that the machine does do some work. And you know, I've been thinking about the same thing in terms of genomics, in cancer genomics, when you have these databases that I use for references in order to mark sequences and find out, for instance, in cancer, which are the ones that you should look at. We stress a lot about the provenance of data and how people do their quality checks, and they have the pulse of what's going on, and really what is the real evidence as opposed to the junk in the developing you know, cancer research literature. But it is also an example of a type of work of juxtaposition and comparison between sequences that is enormously automated, and that is actually doable only because you don't have to look at it all the time, and you can just trust the machine in that sense. So, sorry to interrupt.
I think instinctively, I want to say yes. I don't think it matters the size of the world in one sense, because I think the questions are different, the motivations are different. So from the automation perspective, I think it works best where you've already determined what your question is. So you know what you want to measure, you know what you want to get out from the other side, and so you can hand that task across to AI or to a computer or whatever, because they could do the process of getting hold of the data, analyzing the data, and then you've asked them how to present that data. That, I think, is very different to the creative scientific process of exploring unknowns. So I think this, I think the automation helps absolutely with getting hold of raw data and analyzing it, but I see that as very different. And I think we have to think about where that might take us as scientists into a realm of not necessarily, there are already, if you like, tiers within scientific research, right? We have a level of researchers who are technicians, and then we have researchers, if you like, right? And technicians traditionally, and those barriers are changing as well, and we have to think about where they're going to go. But if you think about, in one sense, a technician is somebody who is incredibly skilled at understanding the way in which a machine or a set of machines work, or a set of techniques work, and can very effectively manage those. And it feels to me that that's what we were looking at in your in the photograph that you put up, Stephan. And that's absolutely valid, and it's part of that scientific process. But that's different, I think, to the creative exploration.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on this last point, one of the challenges in the case of human genomics diversity is that everyone agrees how amazing those new algorithms are in using machine learning to sort of explore the data, right? To consider the different types of hypotheses you can come up with, different types of new questions. So there is no doubt among geneticists about this. However, I think just illustrated by that paper I was talking about, the way that this is presented to the public, right? The public-facing aspect of developing these technologies is a key element, because once you create these visualizations that come out of this incredible machinery, right? They take a life on their own, and the very people who produce those visualizations will disagree about what is the actual purpose and end goal of those visualizations. So the way I see the automation is interesting, because there is, in the human genetics community, there is a lot of promise of where this can lead us, like talks about how we can get better, more accurate data, ways to correct even the biases that come with algorithms. So that's sort of the next frontier, is use automation to correct the very problems created by algorithms. But by doing so, I think we return to the question of trust, right? Like perhaps scientists will somehow trust the algorithm, but how the public will receive that is a different question.
Yeah, it's like the passing through. So so much to pick up on. I think just quickly to the point that Sabina mentioned, like the small worlds. I've been thinking of building small worlds, because a lot of this work on automation in the life science lab is like your journey towards automation. And there are commercial players who come in. So it's a question also of agency, like how do you generate your small world that you're in? And you, as a researcher, you're kind of, how much agency do you have in this? Because there's big players who sell these automated systems as well. So I think how we can build these systems in a truly local manner and kind of retain a certain agency level in that is really important. With the question of trust, just to comment on that, what I think is really interesting is in a lot of these discussions about how to make things like that happen, not just, there's a huge literature, and I've mentioned that in like internal talks before or whatnot, but like on human automation team formation. So that's again an interdisciplinary moment. There are people who work with the US Air Force to understand unmanned aerial vehicles and kind of how can we have an attack force where we kind of trust that the machine will not start shooting us. And so there's a, this goes back 40 years and more, and it's kind of a, we can use the military industrial complex and the applied research they've been doing to inform, in some sense, what kind of teams are we forming here? What does situational awareness mean? And yeah, I think just 2 points.
Fantastic, thank you. So yeah, if I could just invite questions and maybe even comments even better, given that we have little time. So maybe I'll go through. Let's see, or
it's interesting. I think none of you is addressing, well, I mean, as an old person, I guess I'm concerned about this, the motivational structure of scientists actually who are engaged in automated research is changing quite dramatically, I think. It's interesting because I think sociologists and you people still have the same motivational structure that us people used to have, but I think that automation is going to change that motivational structure, and yet universities are still based on credit to be assigned to an individual, which is a difficult thing, I think.
This is speaking mostly to Stephan and James. It seems to me that from a philosophy perspective, you're not going to be able to make much sense of automation without having a good sense of scientific agency, right? So part of the main points is that these autonomous systems both create what you call displacement or distance, but they also increase certain ways in which sciences can sort of enact their agency. So it seems to me that this is a really important and crucial sort of thing that philosophers of science haven't really done much on, right? So there's, people like Karen Barad and Andy Pickering, of course, have done lots of work. There's lots of stuff adjacent. So it seems like there's sort of a really, really big project that philosophers of science haven't really started yet, I don't think, to try and grapple with scientific agency and how that relates to knowledge production. And then I think we can then make sense of whatever that word is once we've done that.
Yeah, it's a frustrating Marxist comment. The robot at the grocery store refers to the person that checks your ID as the assistant. And it seems like one of the things that was sort of touched on by a lot of people but neglected explicitly was the role of kind of alienation and disenfranchisement that happens because of these technologies, and how they convert a lot of people who were formerly theorists and practice people into technicians. And with the increasing possibility of automated hypothesis generation, it may turn the role of the practicing educated scientist into the role of a technician as well. That's just terrifying Marxist.
Thanks for the great talk. So I was wondering, we use informatics tools to study the life sciences, perhaps in order to explain this complexity of life systems. But tools like AI are becoming increasingly powerful and useful. But in this process, so the complexity of those tools themselves is also increasing. So it seems we are making things even more complicated. So philosophy is not only good at criticizing, but also at classifying, creating criteria. But is this classification a way to break down this complexity, and how should we deal with this complexity caused by those tools? Thank you.
Other comments? I may just give you about 30 seconds each to become whatever you want.
I just want to reply to Tyler quickly. I think this is a very important point. Actually, a lot of the cloud labs, self-driving labs, they like to hire Amazon logistics people, because the running is and then the commercial players that I mentioned, they notice those worries. So they say, you'll be free. The machines only take over mere manual labor. You can do the proper science. They use these words. You can do true science and all that. So and it goes into how motivation and incentive structures are reshaped. And I think that goes back to what philosophy can add, and also organizational studies, a really key point.
Okay, 30 seconds. There were a lot said here, I want to actually pick up on the idea of motivation, but exploring it at a lower scale, let's say. So one of the big problems with all this algorithms and discussion of human genetic diversity is the way that scientists themselves motivate their work. So oftentimes we see people just interested, in exploring the history of human evolution, but they have to justify that in terms of medical genetics and precision medicine. So what this means is that many scientists agree that for precision medicine, you don't need like categories like race, ethnicity, and even ancestry. However, because what they are really interested in is evolution, they end up transporting categories from one context to the other because of incentive structures, right? Like precision medicine.
Just picking up on 2 points over that. I mean, I think biologists have to all have therapy. I think we have to start to talk about what we do, why we do it, how we do it. And I think AI kind of brings that into sharp focus. The need for that. How we do it is a different matter.
Yeah, yeah, I wanted to say something about, I agree with what Adrian was saying, that there is, I think, a lot of work from a non-philosopher of science, somebody who's got a bit of a big toe in. The philosophy of science hasn't done enough work on reflecting on what I think about in terms of the changing nature of scientific work. And that's why I bring it back to other literature and questions in general about the changing nature of work in the context of digital technology. And doing that kind of work would also help, I think, to address some of the questions on this enfranchisement and alienation. I'll bring it as a kind of provocation. I'll bring in the room's favorite philosopher, Martin Heidegger, who said, but it's still quite a fundamental insight, I think, at least for me, in the way I think about, how we square this divide between technological determinism and constructivist theory of technology. He talks about, technology as essentially changing the problem that it's supposed to solve. So if you think about the telephone, it is built in order to destroy the distance between the caller and the listener, between the two people having a conversation. But the result is that you are not having a conversation the way you would be having it if you were in the same room. A conversation on the telephone is a different kind of conversation with different kind of misunderstandings and issues. So then he talks about, undistance. It's the kind of a complete bypassing of the question of distance. And I think that is a bit of my starting question when I try to think about these things.
So I have been thinking a lot about standardization and what that does. And these large-scale data infrastructures is in one way an attempt to embrace complexity in the world, but also trying to manage it by, for instance, standardizing data formats. And I think my role as a philosopher is not to break down complexity or to be pessimistic, but rather to expose the complexity and expose the trade-offs in those simplification strategies. Because there are certain things that can be done, it has some certain affordances, but it also has some, there's a cost. There's a cost in terms of data work for specific people involved. And I also want to remind people that a lot of the data for life science research is not produced by scientists. It's produced by patients and clinicians, and they have to do their work. And quite often when you implement new IT systems with automated strategies for filling in data for research purposes, it actually does the opposite of the intention. It increases the data work because people are faced with data validation issues, which is a problem both for the clinical work, but also for the reuse of data. And we have some quite worrying examples of that from Denmark, where they implement new IT structures without testing them, which caused a lot of problems. So yeah, sorry, that was more than 30 seconds.